Somewhere around 1610, a typesetter in London may have misread a single letter in a Shakespeare manuscript. That mistake got printed, reprinted, and eventually given to millions of children as their name. The name is Imogen, and it might not be a name at all. To understand how a typo becomes a name, you have to understand how books got made in Shakespeare's England. There was no spell check. There was no author reviewing final proofs with a red pen. A playwright like Shakespeare would hand over manuscript pages, sometimes messy ones, to a compositor, basically a skilled but overworked typesetter who would physically arrange individual metal letters into a printing frame. These men worked fast, they worked under pressure, and they worked with handwriting that was not always clean. The early 1600s were also a moment when English spelling itself was not standardized. The same word could appear 3 different ways on the same page and nobody would blink. Names were even more fluid. A name was roughly whatever you wrote down, and nobody was cross-referencing a database. In that environment, a single misread letter was not just possible, it was practically routine. The wonder is not that errors happened. The wonder is that we are still living inside one of them more than 400 years later. The story begins with a play called Cymbeline. Shakespeare almost certainly wrote it around 1610, near the end of his career. It is a strange, sprawling romance set in ancient Britain, mixing Roman history with fairy tale logic. The heroine of that play is a princess, one of Shakespeare's most resilient and quietly powerful female characters. And in the version of the play published in the First Folio of 1623, she is called Imogen. Here's where things get complicated. There's a scholar named Simon Forman, an astrologer and diarist who actually attended Shakespeare performances in 1611, just 1 year after Cymbeline was likely written. Forman kept detailed notes on the plays he saw. His account of Cymbeline, written in his own hand, refers to the heroine not as Imogen, but as Innogen. That is 2 N's, Innnogen. Forman was a witness to the living performance before the printing press had a chance to do its work. Then there's the researcher and editor Edmund Malone, working in the late 1700s, who began combing through early Shakespeare texts with unusual rigor for his era. Malone noticed inconsistencies between surviving manuscript references and the printed First Folio. He was not the last to flag the Imogen problem, but he was among the first to treat it as a genuine textual issue rather than just a variant spelling. The argument made by later scholars, including those working on the ardent Shakespeare editions in the 20th century, is this. Innogen was almost certainly the original name. It has real roots. There's a character named Innogen in the early chronicles that Shakespeare drew on, Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, written around 1138, in which Innogen appears as a legendary queen of ancient Britain, wife of the Trojan founder Brutus. Shakespeare was a voracious recycler of source material. He would absolutely have encountered that name in his reading, and it would have fit the play's ancient British setting perfectly. So how do you get from Innogen to Imogen? In the handwriting style common to Shakespeare's period called secretary hand, a double N could look remarkably like the letters M and N placed together. A compositor staring at a rushed manuscript, working under time pressure, could very plausibly read Innogen and set the type as Imogen. One letter, essentially, one ambiguous loop in an ink stroke, and the name changed. The First Folio was printed in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death. He was not there to correct anything. The error, if it was one, got locked into the most authoritative text of his works. Every subsequent printing followed the folio, and so Imogen went out into the world. The misconception is actually 2 layered on top of each other. The first is that Imogen is an ancient name with deep historical roots. It is not. It has no recorded origin before 1623. It has no confirmed etymology. Linguists and name historians have been unable to trace it to any Celtic, Latin, or Germanic source with confidence. It is, in the documentary record, a blank wall. The second misconception is that Shakespeare invented it as an act of deliberate creativity. People often say that, treating it as one of the many words and names Shakespeare coined on purpose. But the better evidence suggests he did not invent Imogen at all. He may have been trying to write Innogen, a name with real ancient lineage, and a printing error created something new entirely. What we are left with is a name that millions of people bear today, that appears in baby name books as a distinguished and literary choice, that carries the weight of Shakespearean prestige, and that may have no intentional author at all. It may be the most successful accident in the history of English naming. Imogen has had a real cultural life, entirely independent of the question of whether it was a mistake. The name became moderately fashionable in Britain during the 20th century, and in the 2000s and 2010s it surged dramatically, ranking inside the top 20 girls' names in England and Wales for several consecutive years. It carries, for most people who use it, a sense of literary elegance and quiet strength The character herself has been performed and reinterpreted continuously. In 2016, the Royal Shakespeare Company staged a production that restored the name Innogen throughout, one of the few major productions to make that editorial choice visible to audiences. Critics noticed. Some appreciated the scholarly honesty, others found it jarring, a reminder that the name they had grown up with was contested ground. The name also traveled to music. The British band Coldplay has a song called Careful Where You Stand, and more famously, Chris Martin and Gwyneth Paltrow named their daughter Apple, but Imogen Heap, the British musician and producer, helped cement the name's association with a certain kind of creative independent identity, entirely separate from Shakespeare's play, which most of her fans have never read. The Innogen connection pulls the name into a much older stream of history. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Innogen is part of the legendary foundation mythology of Britain, and the same tradition that gives us King Arthur, that blends Celtic oral history with Latin literary ambition. The name Innogen in that context may connect to a Brythonic root related to words meaning maiden or girl, though scholars are cautious about pressing that etymology too hard given the gap in the record. What is more interesting is what the Imogen story tells us about how language and naming actually work. We tend to assume names have origins, that they were chosen deliberately by some first user who understood what they meant. But Imogen is a case where the origin may be pure accident, where the name exists because of a physical limitation, the ambiguity of handwriting, and an industrial process, the speed of a print shop. The name carries no meaning that its bearer can point to, and yet it feels meaningful because Shakespeare's heroine was brave and loyal and complex, and those qualities transferred. There's also something worth noting about the first folio itself as a source. It is the document we rely on for roughly half of Shakespeare's plays. Without it, Macbeth, The Tempest, Twelfth Night, and many others would be lost. But it was compiled by two of Shakespeare's fellow actors, John Hemingis and Henry Condell, working from manuscripts of varying quality with no author to approve the final text. The folio is a monument and a patchwork simultaneously. Imogen may simply be the most personal scale example of its imperfections, the error that got a name.